a channel where the echoes of the past drift gently across the quiet of the present, softly wrapping you in stories that hum with time, not tension. Tonight, we travel to a place both familiar and distant, to a civilization whose grandeur still shapes our own, and whose contradictions remain quietly instructive. If you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're rewatching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night, or drifting off with the morning light. Now, imagine yourself standing in the sun-drenched courtyard of a Roman villa. Marble columns surround you, their cool surfaces reflecting the muted gold of late afternoon light. There's a faint trickle from a small fountain. Water glides rhythmically into a stone basin, breaking the quiet just enough to soothe the ears. Nearby, vines trail lazily down carved walls, their leaves catching the warm breeze that carries the faintest aroma of fresh bread and olives. You are surrounded by luxury, the kind that does not shout but whispers, in polished silver, in rare fabrics, in the way servants anticipate your movements without command. You are, for tonight, one of the wealthy few, a Roman elite at the height of the Republic, or perhaps in the early days of empire. It is, on the surface, a life of pleasure. But as you will come to see, it is also a life, watched, a life of tension. A life where too much success could attract something darker. Whispers, investigations, confiscations. Or worse, let us begin where this contrast is most quietly visible, in the illusion of safety. A beautiful home, a cultivated image, and beneath it, the slow erosion of trust. The villa was quiet, too quiet, perhaps, but that was the way he liked it. Lucius Septimius was not born wealthy, though his name now evoked a long ancestral line. The truth was much more recent. His fortune had risen in the last 20 years, his estate spreading like slow ivy over his family's modest beginnings. Now he lived on the outskirts of Rome, far enough to breathe, close enough to be seen. Each morning he awoke not to the clang of labor or the scrape of hunger, but to the muted sound of linen curtains pulled gently apart. A servant would speak no words. They never needed to. Lucius preferred silence. His atrium, a wide-open hall at the heart of his home, shimmered with painted walls. Mythological scenes from Troy, from Olympus, adorned the plaster, not new, but always touched up before guests arrived. Everything was curated. The wine poured at dinner came from his own vineyards, or so he said. The olive oil was shipped from Baetica. The slaves wore matched tunics. It was not enough to be rich. One had to be effortlessly rich. In Rome, wealth was a performance, and every gesture was its own kind of script. Imagine him now, seated on a carved wooden couch, the low table before him cluttered not with food, but correspondence. Wax tablets, some with fresh impressions, some with corners worn smooth from anxious thumbing. His steward stands at a slight angle, head bowed, waiting to read the day's inquiries. A cousin requests a loan, discreetly. A magistrate, once an enemy, now seeks partnership in an aqueduct contract. And a letter from the governor of Sicily, all gilded praise and subtle warning. Your generosity has not gone unnoticed. He reads slowly, deliberately. He knows what is being asked, and he knows what happens when you say yes too often, or no, even once. But this morning there is also calm. In the gardens, the scent of rosemary clings to the air. A young girl, a visiting niece, chases a butterfly between hedges shaped like gods. Distantly, a lyre plucks a few notes from another room. Peace, for now. Later in the day, visitors arrive. There is the older senator with thinning hair and eyes like sharpened glass. He speaks softly, but his gaze lingers too long on Lucius's silver ornaments. He notices things, notes things. Then there is the equestrian merchant, younger, more eager, who offers congratulations on Lucius's recent acquisition of farmland in Campania. It was unexpected. Some say undervalued. Some say too good to be true. Lucius smiles. Not too wide. Never too wide. You see, in ancient Rome, being wealthy was not simply about possessing. It was about appearing deserving. Every luxury was a question. How did you afford this? Who do you owe? And worse still, how long until the state decides it wants it back? He offers his guests a light meal, bread crusted with herbs, cheese imported, aged just so, dates, figs, nothing too indulgent. The real display is in the restraint. They eat slowly, discussing politics with the kind of polite vagueness that leaves meaning suspended in the air. The younger guest laughs at the mention of a new consul, and Lucius joins him, though he knows the man's brother has been under investigation. Everyone is under investigation, eventually. Later still, after the guests have departed, Lucius retires to the peristyle garden. The stone underfoot is still warm from the sun. He sits beneath a cypress tree, listening to the low calls of birds returning to their nests. He thinks of nothing, and yet of everything. A neighbor's villa was recently seized, his name quietly erased from public records. Another man, wealthier, perhaps, has not been seen since the last Senate hearing. His estate is quiet now. Too quiet. Lucius knows this life is a balancing act, a quiet theater. Each word, each gift, each silence, a note in a larger melody that must not become discordant. And so the day ends, not with triumph, but with stillness. A stillness you might mistake for peace if you did not know better. In Rome, even stillness was curated. The evening light in Rome had a way of softening even its hardest edges. Stone walls glowed with a warm hue. The shadowed streets, still alive with murmurs of traders and neighbors, lulled themselves into dusk. But even in this glow, beneath the domes of great homes, and within the private atriums of Rome's upper crust, the air held something tighter. Something that watched. To be wealthy in Rome was to be seen. And in being seen, one was judged. Constantly. Imagine now that same villa from earlier, but with different eyes. You are no longer Lucius Septimius. You are an observer, a fellow patrician, or perhaps a rival. Perhaps a man who ran against him for office some years ago. Your smile is pleasant, your words unremarkable, but your thoughts sharper. You note the new marble columns. Imported, costly. He must have had help, or else where did the funds come from? You note the number of slaves in the household, more than last season. His labor force seems to have expanded even as grain prices rise. Curious. You note that his son was recently betrothed to the daughter of a prominent censor. That's not mere matchmaking. That's positioning. You note everything because Rome notes everything. In the late Republic, where power was shared, theoretically, and the ideal citizen was humble and self-sacrificing, excessive wealth was a contradiction. It gleamed too brightly against the worn ideal of the mos maiorum, the ancestral customs that glorified moderation, restraint, and public service. And yet, the wealthy grew wealthier. The estates grew larger. The banquets more elaborate. And the whispers louder. The Senate was not merely a legislative body. It was a theater of reputation. To stand in it meant your finances, your ancestry, your allies, even your household rituals, were all fodder for scrutiny. No decision was truly private. No misstep truly forgotten. There was, of course, no formal crime of being too wealthy. But there were subtler ways to bring a man down. An accusation of bribery, a hint of corruption during a governorship abroad, an implication of disloyalty, or simply an omission, a missed invitation to the right banquet, a quiet shift in alliances. In this way, Rome did not need overt assassinations to eliminate threats. It used reputation as a blade. And wealth was often the handle. Imagine a new figure, Gnaeus Aurelius. He too was once like Lucius, even wealthier perhaps. He had sponsored games in the Forum. He had donated grain during a poor harvest. His name had graced statues and porticos. But he also outshone his peers too quickly. His mansion was mocked in poems, his banquets exaggerated in satirical plays. Young men in the Senate whispered that his generosity was strategic, a veiled run for dictatura. There was no proof. There didn't need to be. One winter, the accusations came, not from enemies, but from friends. A governor returned from the provinces claimed mismanaged funds. A tribune accused him of tampering with elections. A client he once supported failed to gain a post and turned bitter. His estate was seized, pending investigation. His name faded from the rosters. The statues were quietly removed. The fountains stopped flowing, and yet there was no trial, no execution, no spectacle. Just ... silence, the kind that echoes more loudly than shouting. This was the fear that hovered in the homes of the elite, the understanding that prosperity was not simply a reward, but a test, one that you could fail by passing too obviously. In the world of the Roman Republic, being wealthy was a necessary burden. One had to sponsor games, build roads, host festivals, support political allies, and fund temples, and yet do it all without seeming to enjoy it too much. To express pleasure in luxury was vulgar. To appear indifferent to it, that was ideal. But even that was a performance, and performances were always being reviewed. Thus, families like the Cornali or the Claudi developed the art of concealment. Their homes, lavish as they were carefully balanced between splendor and the illusion of traditional austerity. Walls painted in muted tones, colonnades designed with deliberate restraint. Guests fed well, but not decadently. Their wealth was generational, which gave it a kind of legitimacy. But even they were not immune. In times of political stress, even the oldest names could find themselves on the wrong side of a populist tribune's speech. There was no insurance against envy. The political culture of Rome was shaped by competition. Cursus honorum, the ladder of offices, was built on visibility. You had to be known, had to be discussed, had to be remarkable. But the higher you climbed, the fewer the handholds. Even allies were temporary. The concept of amicitia, political friendship, was bound by favors, not loyalty. A man you called brother today might betray you tomorrow, if it suited his advancement. The real threat wasn't assassination or exile. Not yet. It was the erosion of reputation. A dinner missed. A client defector. A comment from a magistrate that subtly questioned your landholdings. These were the first cracks. And once the cracks began to show, they widened quickly. So Lucius Septimius, our villa-dwelling noble, knew this well. He donated quietly to local temples. He deferred often in Senate debates. He allowed his rivals their victories. He ensured his name was never the first spoken at gatherings, but also never the last. It was a delicate choreography. As the evening deepened and torchlight flickered along the walls of his courtyard, Lucius sat with a scroll of Cicero's letters, not because he sought legal wisdom, but because reading Cicero aloud reminded others that he was learned, that he valued the Republic's traditions. The slaves closed the shutters against the cool air. The day had ended, not with celebration, but with careful balance. Another step in the dance. Outside, in the Forum, statues cast long shadows. Names were carved into stone, but even stone in time could be scraped clean. And so, through that ancient city, silence fell again, the kind that comes not from peace ... but from watching, from waiting, from remembering that in Rome, the higher the marble pedestal, the colder the wind had touched your face. By now, you may sense a pattern. In ancient Rome, wealth was not a private thing. It was not guarded behind locked doors or quietly saved away in secret vaults. It lived in the open, in marble fountains, public games, temple donations, and lavish funerals. It moved in the streets. It shimmered in conversation. It fed the city's appetite for spectacle. But with all this display came a less visible cost. To be wealthy in Rome was to be caught in a web of unspoken agreements, of ritualized giving and endless reciprocity. The Roman elite did not simply own wealth. They performed it, and in so doing, wove themselves into the lives of hundreds, sometimes thousands of others. Let's return to Lucius Septimius, our quiet aristocrat with his garden and scrolls. On paper, he owed nothing. He had paid his taxes. His estates were properly managed. His slaves were registered, his household calm. Yet every morning, before his breakfast of bread and honey, he received a procession of men, the ritual of salutatio. Picture them now, lining up in the dim light of early dawn. Some were former slaves, now freedmen. Others were tradesmen, or lesser nobles with debts of their own. Some came simply because their fathers had done so before them, and to break the chain would seem disloyal, even disrespectful. These clientes greeted Lucius as Dominus, not with servile fear, but with performative loyalty. In return, he offered them coins, food, letters of recommendation, or introductions. Sometimes simply his presence was enough. A nod from Lucius could open doors in magistrates' halls. But the exchange was never casual. Each gift planted a seed of expectation. Each favor granted was a thread tightened around him. For every man he supported might someday call in a promise, might seek shelter from legal charges, might request a political endorsement. And if Lucius refused, if he broke the rhythm, then word would spread, the obligation spiraled outward. A wealthy senator might be asked to finance the repair of a bridge in his home province, not by law, but by expectation. Refusal would damage his standing. Acceptance meant hundreds of denarii, quietly vanished from his reserves. A neighbor's daughter might need a dowry, and to say no would insult a family that once backed your campaign for office. A general returning from the frontier might ask you to house his emissaries, a subtle reminder that you once borrowed cavalry horses from his command. And so, for Lucius and men like him, life became a daily negotiation, a quiet calculus, not of numbers, but of relationships, of memory, of appearances. There were no contracts for these exchanges, no receipts, no written promises, and yet they held more power than law. This system was called amicitia, friendship, but not as we know it. It was a code, a currency, and a cage. Even banquets, seemingly indulgent affairs, were rarely about pleasure alone. To host was to display generosity. To invite the right guests, senators, equestrians, poets, military men, was to signal one's alliances. To seat someone near you was an endorsement. To leave them near the door was an insult. Imagine the long triclinium table, the couches arranged in perfect symmetry. Lucius, at the center, toasting with watered wine. The conversation flows, but beneath it, a second language hums, that of strategy, of placement, of subtle signals. The dishes served, are they humble or extravagant? The music played, is it Greek, refined and cultured, or Latin, old and rustic? The guests, are they familiar or carefully chosen for political message? Nothing is accidental, not even the fruit placed beside each plate. And so the web tightens. Each friend, each guest, each favor owed or returned, a knot in the cord that binds the wealthy Ramon to his social world. Now, pause for a moment. Consider how exhausting this must have been. To never act freely, to never give without calculation, to never refuse without cost. To know that your wealth, while envied by many, also fed a system that demanded more of you with each passing year. Lucius knows this. He remembers the story of Quintus Gallus, a wealthy noble whose generosity was legendary. He had fed entire neighborhoods during a grain shortage, sponsored chariot races for 3 days straight, paid the debts of a failing merchant class during an economic downturn. But when he began to say no, the illusion cracked. His clients drifted away. His allies grew cold. Rumors of hoarding spread. And when a political rival accused him of tax evasion, the courts did not protect him. His generosity had earned him applause, but not loyalty. He died in quiet disgrace, alone in a countryside villa. The truth was simple. In Rome, you could never give enough. The more you gave, the more was expected. And when you could give no more, they remembered not your kindness, but your failure to continue it. Lucius walks now in his garden just before sunset. The light filters through cypress branches. A slave follows a few paces behind, waiting silently, holding a scroll with yet another request. A cousin seeks help for his son, accused of misusing public funds. Lucius sighs. He will say yes, not because he believes in the boy's innocence, but because saying no would unravel too much. A friendship, a family connection, a future alliance. So he says yes, and another thread is tied. One day, perhaps, it will pull too tightly. But for now, the garden is still, the breeze is gentle, and the scroll remains sealed. Evening in Rome does not descend quickly. It arrives slowly, casting long shadows across Travertine steps, brushing temples with a dull gold, and softening the harsh lines of power into something that almost resembles peace. But don't be fooled. Even in this hour, when lamps flicker to life and fountains catch the last of the sun's touch, the city remains alert, watching, whispering. In the quiet salons of patrician homes, in the covered porticos where senators stroll in pairs, in the darker corners of wine shops and bathhouses, reputations are always under discussion, always shifting, always fragile. And the wealthiest of Rome's citizens, those who walk in sandals stitched with gold thread and dine beneath painted ceilings, they know this better than anyone. Admiration in Rome was never simple. To be admired was to be watched, and the more people watched, the more they waited. For a misstep, for a moment of weakness, for a reason to doubt that what they saw was deserved. Lucius Septimius felt it often. There was a time, not long ago, when his name was on every tongue. His sponsorship of a new aqueduct had brought water to neglected districts. His feast of Saturnalia had filled the streets with food and light. Children sang his name in festival songs. A statue had even been erected in his honor, modest yet elegant, near the Tiber's bend. But admiration had a peculiar way of decaying. It started with gentle questions. Did Lucius build the aqueduct from his own funds? Or did he divert public money from his governorship in Hispania? Were the games he hosted a generous gesture ... or a calculated move ahead of a planned political campaign? Was the statue proposed by the people or commissioned quietly by his own clients? Each question, harmless on its own, became a thread in a new story, a narrative less flattering, one that twisted the same facts into darker meanings. And that was the real danger. In Rome, wealth alone could not save you, because the same crowd that cheered your generosity one year could mock your arrogance the next. The poet Juvenal, though he would come later in time, captured this truth well. Who can be so fortunate, so beyond envy, as to escape slander? Lucius's estate, once admired, was now too large. His banquets, once praised, now seemed excessive. His friends, once all eyes, now whispered of ambition. His silence in Senate debates, once a mark of dignity, now appeared suspicious. Imagine a single evening. A guest arrives late to Lucius's home, flushed, excited, slightly drunk. He has come from another gathering, one where his name was mentioned, not kindly. He leans in, speaking too freely. They say you've grown too powerful, he says, that you're building your own party, that the consul fears you. Lucius laughs softly, not too loudly. He says nothing more. But the seed is planted. He will not sleep well that night. In Rome, the path from admiration to accusation was short, and there was precedent. There was always precedent. Consider Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Roman history. He built his fortune through shrewd property acquisitions, through buying burnt homes and rebuilding them, through calculated alliances. At his height, he financed armies, influenced elections, and kept entire factions indebted. He was admired, feared, envied, but never trusted. His death, far from Rome in the Parthian desert, did not save him from ridicule. Poets mocked his greed. Senators dismissed his legacy. His wealth, once the envy of all, was recast as the root of his undoing. Then there was Gaius Verus, governor of Sicily. His lavish feasts, his collection of stolen art, his towering estate, all symbols of a man too rich, too proud, too unafraid. Cicero, in his prosecution, did not need to invent much. The people were already prepared to believe the worst. The admiration Verres once enjoyed evaporated in the dry heat of public suspicion. Even Julius Caesar, beloved by the masses, faced the same currents. His victories, his reforms, his generosity, all questioned, all recast as ambition, all rewritten, in the end, into the justification for his murder. It is always the same cycle. A man rises. He is praised. He is envied. He is doubted. He is removed, sometimes with words, sometimes with exile, sometimes ... with quieter means. And so Lucius Septimius, walking in his courtyard as the stars begin to flicker above the tiled roof, reflects on the strange gravity of admiration. He knows that each compliment hides a test, that each hand on his shoulder may one day withdraw, that each gift he gives may return, not in gratitude, but in expectation. There is a statue in his atrium, not of himself, of course. That would be unseemly. It is of his father, or at least the man he claims as his father, for ancestry was, like wealth, sometimes curated. He looks at the statue now, its face worn smooth by years of incense smoke and subtle veneration, and he wonders how long it will stand. Will his own name be remembered? Or will it be scratched away, like so many others? Will his wealth protect him, or expose him? The wind rustles the leaves outside. A servant walks past, careful not to disturb. Somewhere, a lyre plays, faint, delicate, like a lullaby from a distant villa. And still, Lucius remains, watching, waiting, walking the line between glory and downfall. In Rome, wealth was not only possession. It was performance. It was burden. And in the end, it was danger. The streets of the Romang Forum were never silent. Even in the blue-gray light before dawn, the paving stones echoed with soft footsteps of slaves opening market stalls, of scribes hurrying toward the curia, of magistrates' assistants arranging scrolls in marble chambers. And as the sun crested the hills east of the city, its rays illuminated not just temples and columns, but tensions. In the Republic's heyday, Rome liked to believe it was not ruled by kings, nor by tyrants, but by law. Res publica, the public thing. Power, in theory, belonged to the people, to the Senate, to elected officials who rose through merit, through lineage, and, though they would not admit it, through money. But money always complicated things. The ideals of Rome's republic were austere. The great figures of the early republic, Cincinnatus, Camillus, Fabricius, were praised not for wealth, but for restraint. They farmed their own land. They wore plain tunics. They refused gold when offered. And yet, those stories were more legend than law. By the late 2nd century BCE, Rome had changed. The wars against Carthage, Greece, and the eastern kingdoms had poured unimaginable wealth into the city. Generals returned with spoils. Traders, landowners, and lenders grew rich on the margins of conquest. What had once been a city of small landowners was becoming a place of towering estates, private armies, and imported luxuries. And those who grew rich grew visible. Too visible. In theory, the Senate welcomed men of means. The nobles, the patricians, the long-established families. They maintained their seats through a mixture of tradition, patronage, and performance. But when new men, homines novi, rose to prominence, often through military success or commercial brilliance, the older class watched them with unease. Imagine a man like Publius Decimus, fictional, but entirely plausible. He returns to Rome after 10 years as a quaestor in the provinces. He has not only fulfilled his duties, but invested shrewdly in mining ventures and land acquisition. He arrives with 500 new clients, 3 estates in Latium, and a chest of silver as heavy as a cart. He donates funds to repair a dilapidated road, funds a month of public games, marries the daughter of a prominent senator, and then he announces his candidacy for praetor. His wealth is admired and feared. In the Curia, where senators gather beneath painted ceilings and carved laurel wreaths, whispers circulate. Decimus seeks to buy the Republic. He funds loyalty, not earns it. He threatens the old order, but they cannot attack his wealth directly, for they too have wealth. So they attack the appearance of ambition. They accuse him of ambitio, electoral bribery, a subtle word, one with moral weight, hard to prove but easy to believe. Soon others follow. "Did you hear," says one tribune, "that he paid musicians to sing his name in the Subura? Didn't his brother escape charges for grain fraud? Doesn't he host too many feasts for a man who claims to value modesty?" And so admiration turns. Again, it is not the people who turn against him first. They enjoy the games, the food, the coin. It is his peers, those who feel the weight of his shadow. This dynamic between wealthy individuals rising on the tide of personal fortune and a Senate built on cautious tradition shaped the political climate of the late Republic. And the Senate, though powerful, had no police. It had no true enforcement body. It relied instead on prestige, norms, and prosecution. So the law became a tool, not of justice, but of restraint. A man might be accused of maestas, a vague charge of undermining the dignity of the Roman people, or of peculatus, misusing public funds, or repetunde, extortion during provincial administration. Each charge, wrapped in Latin precision, gave the illusion of legality. But behind the scrolls and the speeches lay a simpler truth. You had become inconvenient, and it was wealth that marked you. Not because wealth itself was illegal, but because it suggested independence, because it allowed you to fund your own campaigns, raise your own clients, win the favor of the crowd without passing through senatorial gates. To be too wealthy in Rome was not just a matter of coin. It was a declaration. I do not need your permission to rise. And so the Republic, wary, guarded, conservative in its soul, responded with elegant violence. It used tradition like a shield. It accused in the name of justice. It performed virtue while practicing exclusion. Of course, not all wealthy men were punished. Some played the game well. They shared their fortune carefully, deflected attention, avoided spotlight, supported the right causes at the right time. But others, like the Gracchi brothers, whom we shall explore soon, learned what it meant to fly too close to Rome's sacred ideals. In the Forum, beneath the open sky, the voices of orators echoed daily. Some called for reform, some for vengeance, some for glory. All knew they were being watched. And wealth, however silent in the purse, rang loudly in the ears of those who feared its power. So as the sun sets on this first glimpse into political Rome, imagine the Forum again, the marble still warm from the day's heat. the columns casting long shadows toward the Palatine, the statues of old generals gazing down with cold eyes. And in the distance, another wealthy man prepares his speech. He believes the people admire him, that he has done good, that his coins have bought loyalty. But Rome listens differently now, and the Senate is sharpening its language. In the slow-turning wheel of Rome's history, few stories glow quite as steadily or as sadly as that of the Gracchi. Imagine now a different Rome, still marble and shadow, still columns and chatter. But the year is 133 BCE. The Republic, though intact, is beginning to show its fractures. The city has grown. Its wealth has multiplied, but not for everyone. The small farmers, once the proud backbone of Rome's armies, have begun to disappear. Wars in Spain and Greece and Asia have lasted years, drawing men far from their plots. In their absence, the lands fall into debt, or worse, are quietly absorbed by wealthy landlords. The latifundia, great estates, spread like creeping ivy across the Italian countryside, worked by imported slaves, untouched by military draft, unburdened by modesty. And so the city swells with the dispossessed, landless citizens who can no longer serve in the army, who crowd into Rome's underbelly, living on grain subsidies, dreaming of what was taken from them. And into this quiet despair steps Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. Born of noble blood, educated in the traditions of the Republic, Tiberius could have followed the traditional path, rising slowly, cautiously, with deference. But he does something rare. He looks around and he acts. He proposes a law, lex agraria, a land reform. The idea is, on its surface, simple. Public lands which have been unfairly claimed by the elite should be reclaimed, broken up, given back to the poor, to veterans, to farmers, to citizens who could serve again. It is not an entirely new proposal, but the way he pushes it is. He bypasses the Senate, appeals directly to the plebeian assembly, uses his wealth, his reputation, his name, as Gracchus, son of a former consul, grandson of Scipio Africanus, to push the matter forward. And suddenly, admiration curdles. To the people, he is a savior, a man of marble halls who speaks the language of the poor. To the Senate, he is something else, a disruptor, a populist, a wealthy man wielding generosity like a dagger. Tiberius is not poor. He is not desperate. He is safe, by birth, by class, by wealth, and that makes him dangerous, because he cannot be bought, and that, in Rome, is frightening. The accusations come quickly, that he seeks kingship, that he wears regal robes, that he intends to remain tribune beyond the legal term, a break from sacred custom. And so, on a summer day in the Forum, during a simple vote, the air shifts. Senators, led by Scipio Nasica, wrap their togas around their arms, grab whatever stones and benches they can lift, and storm the gathering. There is no legal motion, no trial, only silence broken by shouting, only votes replaced by fists, only law replaced by death. Tiberius is killed, beaten to death by fellow senators. His body is thrown into the Tiber. The Republic that day crossed a line. For centuries, Rome prided itself on civitas, civil discourse. Even civil strife had rules. But now, political murder had entered the lexicon, not from tyrants, from peers. The reaction is quiet, shocked, then quiet again, until 10 years later. Enter Gaius Gracchus, younger brother, sharper mind, deeper wounds. He has learned from his brother's death, but not the lesson his enemies hoped. He too rises to the office of tribune. He too proposes reforms, not just land, but grain subsidies, military supply regulations, even the extension of citizenship. But his proposals go further. He challenges the power of the Senate directly, reforms the courts, introduces equestrian juries, seeks to transfer authority into the hands of the people. And again, the city divides. To the poor, he is generous, righteous, a symbol. To the Senate, he is something worse than ambitious. He is effective. Gaius builds alliances, networks, support across Italy. And that makes the elite uneasy. He is re-elected to tribune, an unprecedented second term. The Senate cannot bear it. They fear a new tradition is forming. Powerful men, backed by wealth, bypassing them altogether. They wait and then act. In 121 BCE, violence erupts again. A Senate decree, the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, is issued, urging magistrates to protect the Republic by any means necessary. Gaius is not formally charged. He is not arrested. He is simply hunted. He flees to the Aventine Hill with a few loyal followers. There is no army, no rebellion, just a cornered man. And there, before dawn, he takes his own life. Or is killed. The accounts disagree. His head is taken as proof. His supporters are slaughtered, their bodies left in the streets. The city is quiet again. Too quiet. The brothers are gone. But something has changed. Because what they represented, not just reform, but wealth in service of the many, remains deeply uncomfortable to the Roman elite. The Gracchi were not radicals. They were aristocrats. They dined in the same halls, quoted the same histories, wore the same rings, but they used their wealth to give, not to guard. And that, more than any speech, unsettled the Senate. Their generosity was not a performance. It was policy. And that made it dangerous. In the years that followed, the Republic would drift further from its ideals. Others would come. Marius, Sulla, Caesar, men who used wealth, power, and charisma to reshape the city's bones. But the Gracchi remained the turning point. Not for what they did, but for what was done to them. And for what their fate taught every wealthy man who followed. Give carefully. Appear humble. And never forget, admiration can be fatal. There is a quiet way that things change in a city. First, an act seems unthinkable. Then, shocking. Then ... routine. Rome, after the Gracchi, entered a twilight where violence no longer startled. It simply was. The Forum, once a place of measured speeches and contested ideals, became a theater for confrontation. Statues still stood. The rostra still echoed with polished Latin. But between the marble feet and beneath the echoing arches, something else moved. Groups, gangs, retinues, not soldiers, not armies. Just citizens armed, paid, loyal to individuals, not to law. And the men who paid them? Wealthy, ambitious, smiling still, but guarded now. Their names were familiar, their sandals fine. But behind their eyes, something had hardened. Let us begin with Gaius Marius. A man from humble origins, a novus homo, a new man. Wealthy, yes, but not by lineage, by victory, by war. He reformed the Roman army, drawing in landless men, those who previously had no place in military service. In doing so, he gained something rare, loyalty that transcended law. His soldiers owed him everything, their land, their livelihood, their honor. This quietly reshaped the Republic. Because now, a man's power was no longer measured in Senate votes, but in how many swords followed his voice. Marius used this power at first to fight foreign threats, Numidians, Germans, but over time, his gaze turned inward, toward rivals, toward Rome itself, and standing opposite him, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician, elegant, cold, wealthy by inheritance and conquest alike. Sulla believed in tradition, but also in his own supremacy. The two clashed, not just in policy, but in purpose. Their rivalry spilled from chambers into streets, from streets into provinces, and then, shockingly, back into Rome, For the first time in the Republic's long life, a Roman army marched on Rome itself. It was Sulla, returning from campaign, his soldiers at his side, not to defend the city, but to control it. The streets, once filled with vendors and jurists, now echoed with the tread of boots. Swords glinted where scrolls once ruled. Citizens watched from behind shuttered windows. Sulla entered the city not as a general seeking applause, but as a judge, one who would not ask for justice, but dispense it. What followed was the prescription, a word, gentle in sound, but heavy in weight. Lists were posted. Names, men who had opposed him, senators, magistrates, equestrians, landowners, their crime, loyalty to Marius, or influence, or simply visibility, their punishment, death. The lists were not long at first, but they grew. Rewards were offered for those who killed the proscribed. Properties were confiscated and redistributed, often to Sulla's own supporters. Fortunes changed hands not through inheritance, but through fear. Some fled, some hid. Some were betrayed by friends, clients, even family. And all of it, began with wealth. Because each death served two purposes: remove a threat and seize an estate. Imagine, if you will, the estate of Marcus Antistius. Fictional, again, but entirely possible. A villa in the hills, rich with olive trees, its floors lined with mosaics of gods and heroes. He once hosted a banquet for Sulla himself, but now his name is on the list. And by dusk, his home is not his own, his horses taken, his scrolls burned, his name erased. This is how power consolidated, quietly, efficiently, and under the thin veil of legality. After Sulla, the Republic tried to restore itself. But the mold had been broken. Violence had worked, and others remembered. One of them was Publius Clodius Pulcher. Clodius was not a general. He had no legions, but he understood crowds. He used his fortune and his family name to build a following not of soldiers, but of gangs. Rowdy, energetic, dangerous. Clodius knew how to move people, literally. He filled the streets with chants, interrupted trials, disrupted elections. Those who crossed him found themselves shouted down or worse, cornered by clubs and alleyways. He passed laws that benefited the poor, distributed grain, protected freedmen. But each act was political theater, designed to build loyalty. Rome's streets in his time were battlegrounds. And opposing him, Titus Annius Milo, his mirror image. Also rich, also armed, also backed by street gangs. Their rivalry was infamous, their confrontations brutal. And in the end, it ended, as these things now did, in blood. Clodius was murdered on the Appian Way, ambushed as he traveled. His body was dragged into a nearby tavern and left there. The response? Riots, fires. The Curia Hostilia, Rome's ancient Senate house, burned to the ground by an angry mob. This was no longer the Rome of Cicero's careful words or Cato's stoic silences. This was a Rome where street politics had replaced Senate procedure, where blades spoke more loudly than decrees, where wealth was not a shield, but a target and a weapon. Each faction was funded, each riot financed, each voice bought, and still the Republic pretended it lived. It passed laws, held elections, delivered speeches beneath scorched ceilings. But the soul of the Republic, the idea that reason, custom, and shared power could govern a people, was thinning, like a sheet worn through. Now, wealth no longer simply corrupted. It mobilized. It raised crowds, built walls, hired guards, paid poets to praise, and informants to accuse. The game had changed. And the wealthy who survived, they learned to choose sides, to pick generals, to invest in chaos, just as one invests in land or livestock. And so the city waited, quiet again. But differently now, the silence was not peaceful. It was the breath before another name was scratched into stone. The courtrooms of Rome had never been quiet places. They were open-air forums, shaded porticos where citizens gathered not only for justice, but for drama. Orators gestured widely. Crowds murmured. Judges sat on curved benches, draped in togas. Accusers recited long, rehearsed speeches. Defendants, flanked by clients, answered in carefully measured tones. And through it all, reputations rose or fell. But in the final decades of the Republic, something changed. Trials were no longer about guilt or innocence. Not truly. They became theater. Elaborate performances, scripted, funded, and often decided before they began. They became, in essence, warnings. Imagine the trial of a man like Lucius Calpurnius Piso, wealthy, dignified. A provincial governor returned from his post in Asia Minor. He had done what many did, extracted tribute, raised taxes, pressed local leaders for coin in exchange for protection, a common practice. But when Piso returned to Rome, the political winds had shifted. A rival faction, seeking to curry favor with the people, or simply to thin the ranks of influence, accused him of extortion, repetunde. The charges were delivered with formality. The evidence, vague but suggestive. The witnesses, carefully chosen. The jurors, drawn not from neutral peers, but from allies of his opponents. His guilt was never proven, nor needed to be. The real purpose of the trial was not justice. It was reallocation. Piso's estate was seized, his lands divided, his reputation ruined. The message was clear: be careful who you support. And so, trials became a mechanism of control. Wealth could no longer hide behind distance or decorum. If you had means, you had enemies. If you had enemies, you had vulnerability. If you had both, you had reason to fear the courts. Sometimes, the trials weren't even held. A man might receive a message. Present yourself before the Senate. The accusation was unstated, but understood. He might delay, or flee, or quietly take his own life, as many did, preferring self-destruction to the public stripping of honor. And what of the Senate? This body, once the moral compass of the Republic, now found itself complicit, not through malice, but through survival. It could not stop the violence of Sulla, nor the street mobs of Clodius. It could not prevent Caesar's rise, nor Brutus's reckoning. It could only observe, react, adjust. So it adapted. It allowed prosecutions to proceed, even when unjust. It approved confiscations, knowing they served private ends. It voted in favor of strongmen, hoping to be spared their wrath. In doing so, the Senate preserved its form, but not its function. It still met, still debated, still clothed itself in the trappings of tradition. But its soul, the auctoritas that once gave it weight, was fading. Wealthy senators who might once have spoken boldly now deferred. Those who once competed for prestige now competed for safety. The great houses of Rome, the Cornelii, the Fabii, the Aemili, began to adopt a new strategy: silence. To be too visible was to risk exposure. To be too generous was to invite envy. To speak too often was to be remembered. And memory, in this time, was not always kind, so the elite adjusted. They downsized their festivals. They limited public gifts. They spoke with caution in Senate debates. They ensured their names appeared neither too early nor too late in official records. They lived not for glory, but for longevity. This was the quiet transformation of the Roman aristocracy, from statesmen to survivors, from voices to echoes. A few resisted. Cato the Younger, proud, defiant, rigid. He chose death over compromise. Cicero, eloquent, skilled, but tragically trusting. He died with his tongue cut out, a symbol to others. And still the system marched on. By the time Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE, the Republic had already grown brittle. The tools of power had changed hands, and those hands were no longer soft with parchment and pen, but rough with command. Yet even in the quietest corners of Roman life, the danger remained. Imagine now a modest estate near Tibur. Vineyards stretch in soft rows down a terraced hillside. The owner, a man once close to Crassus, now lives simply. He no longer travels to the Forum. He donates quietly to temples. He invites no poets. He writes no letters. He has survived, but he has vanished. And in Rome, the two are increasingly the same. Because wealth, even hidden, leaves traces. A new official might remember an old debt. A younger rival might seek to prove himself with an accusation. A neighbor's client might overhear something and report it. In this climate, trust disappeared. Friendship grew formal. Marriage became alliance. And generosity, once the mark of greatness, became the edge of a knife. And so we leave segment 2 not with a bang, but with a whisper. The Republic, still standing, still speaking in measured tones, had become something else. A place where power moved behind doors, and where the wealthiest citizens no longer celebrated their fortune, but hid it. Because to be seen in such a world was to be selected, and to be selected was to be lost. The Republic had ended, not with formal ceremony, but with weariness. The Senate still met. Laws were still written. Elections, in some shape, still occurred. But no one doubted where power now lived. It lived in the Palatine, in the great palaces overlooking the Forum. It moved quietly and absolutely through the words of a single man, the princeps, the first citizen, the emperor. Augustus, the first to hold the title, ruled with subtlety. He knew appearances mattered. He refused the crown, accepted the title. He preserved the illusion of shared power, even as he quietly absorbed it. And yet, even in this gentler tyranny, something fundamental had shifted. The rules had changed. In the Republic, wealth made a man dangerous politically. In the Empire, wealth made a man dangerous personally. Because now, there was only one center of gravity. And to shine too brightly near the emperor was to invite a cold, sidelong glance, a pause in conversation, a letter, a summons, and silence. Let us walk now through the marble halls of the early imperial palace. The mosaics glint beneath your feet. The walls are lined with statues, some gods, some ancestors, some flatterers in heroic poses. Slaves pad silently across the polished floors, carrying trays, scrolls, messages. You pass through archways into courtyards, where senators gather not to debate, but to wait, their togas pristine, their posture careful, their laughter, if it comes at all, brief and measured. Here, proximity to power is currency. And every man in this place knows that his wealth, his eloquence, even his beauty, could be interpreted in two ways, as a gift or as a threat. Consider the case of Gaius Silius, a senator and general under the reign of Tiberius, the second emperor. Silius was successful, intelligent, and immensely wealthy. He had served with distinction in Germania. He was married, well-connected, admired. But admiration is a dangerous thing. Silius's home was grand, too grand, some whispered. His influence in the provinces, troubling. And most of all, his relationship with Sejanus, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, was too close. When Sejanus fell, accused of treason, perhaps rightly, perhaps not, Silius fell with him. No evidence was required. His wealth alone was sufficient justification. His estate was seized, his name scratched out, his body quietly removed. This was a new kind of Rome. It no longer needed trials. It no longer needed mobs. It needed only suspicion. And wealth ... always invited suspicion. Tiberius himself, who began his reign with promise and quiet control, grew colder with age. He withdrew from Rome to the island of Capri, leaving governance in the hands of intermediaries and spies. From his cliff-top villa, with views stretching far into the blue, he read reports not only of foreign campaigns and provincial grain counts, but of dinner conversations, guest lists, inheritances, property transfers. A man who left his fortune to someone other than the emperor. Suspicious. A man who held banquets with too many guests. Provocative. A man whose gardens outshone imperial villas. Insolent. The Praetorian Guard, once a ceremonial force, became an extension of the emperor's gaze. They moved through the streets not as protectors, but as collectors. Of whispers. Of names. Of necks. Senators began to live like actors in a long, uneasy play. They praised carefully. They spent cautiously. They gave gifts, often to the imperial family, with sincerity that was always slightly performative. No one truly knew the line between generosity and arrogance, so they erred on the side of fear. Imagine Lucius Valerius, a wealthy aristocrat under Caligula. He hosts a private dinner, only 5 guests. He orders modest dishes. He quotes Virgil, not Homer. He ensures the emperor's name is toasted first and last. Still, the next day, he is summoned. Not because of the dinner, perhaps, but because a slave reported he kept a statue of Augustus in his garden, larger than the emperor's. The wealthiest learned to disguise their wealth. They let their villas fall slightly into disrepair. They delayed repainting frescoes. They wore plainer rings. They sent their sons abroad to learn, though often simply to stay away. It became known, softly but clearly, that the safest posture was that of quiet competence. Wealthy enough to be useful, never enough to be envied. Some emperors encouraged this climate actively. Domitian, later in the century, required senators to attend him daily, standing in rows, silent, awaiting notice. He monitored building projects, taxed inheritances, and issued edicts about household expenses. His fear was not of rebellion. It was of replacement. And replacement, in the empire, rarely came from peasants. It came from fellow nobles, from those who had enough land to feed a legion, enough clients to start a movement, enough charm to be followed. So the pattern persisted. Wealthy men died, and their estates were absorbed into imperial holdings. Their children disappeared. Their names, once etched into arches and fountains, were rubbed out, a practice known as damnatio memoria. Memory itself could be punished, and so the elite learned. They offered wealth before it could be taken. They named the emperor in their wills. They donated fountains and libraries in his honor. They carved his face onto their rings, but even flattery had limits. When Flavius Sabinus, a man of modest demeanor but immense property, dared to oppose Nero's building plans in the Senate, he was found dead within a week. Heart failure, the scrolls said. The marble from his villa was used in a new imperial bath complex. This, too, became part of the rhythm. To be rich was to be useful, until you were not. And then your riches were no longer yours. So the palace stood, serene, in white stone and gilded bronze. And beneath it, Rome walked more softly, praised more carefully, dined more quietly. Because in this new empire, danger did not come from the forum, or from elections, or from public mobs. It came from behind silk curtains, from a glance, from a name added to a list, and a fortune quietly reassigned. Imagine Rome now, not bustling and loud as in the days of the Republic, but quieter, controlled, with a kind of silence that sits heavily on the shoulders. The forum still gleams, the palaces still rise, but something in the air is shifted. You feel it not in the streets, but in the eyes. In the way senators glance sideways before speaking. In the way doors close more quickly. In the way servants seem to listen, even when dismissed. This is the Rome of Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was not born noble, not wealthy by inheritance, but he understood power. And more importantly, he understood how power worked under emperors. Sejanus rose not through bloodline or fortune, but through proximity. He was the Praetorian prefect, commander of the emperor's personal guard, an office once ceremonial, now ... essential. Under Tiberius, Sejanus became more than an officer. He became a filter, a gatekeeper, a whisperer. Nothing reached the emperor without passing through him. And that, in imperial Rome, was the truest form of wealth. With access came opportunity. Sejanus began to control appointments, recommend magistrates, investigate rivals, all in the name of loyalty, all cloaked in the soft vocabulary of duty. But soon, that vocabulary turned darker. He began to suggest that certain men were untrustworthy, that others had designs on imperial power, that a letter, a glance, a gift might hint at treason. No evidence was needed, only suggestion. And the accusations began, quietly at first, then louder. Men of influence, men with large estates, distant cousins of the imperial family, wealthy patrons of the arts, began to disappear. Some were tried, most were not. Their homes were sealed, their names removed, their property absorbed by the state or redistributed to those loyal to Sejanus. It was not just a purge. It was a method. Sejanus created a climate where speaking openly was foolish and appearing wealthy was reckless. To have gold, land, or even fine marble in your atrium, it drew eyes. He built a network of informants, slaves, freedmen, even senators themselves. Anyone could be an accuser. Anyone could be watching. A dinner guest might report your choice of poetry. A client might notice your new mosaic. A servant might whisper of a private conversation. And within days, a letter might arrive. Not from the emperor, but from Sejanus. Imagine now the villa of Titus Sabinus, a friend of the imperial family, respected, discreet, and deeply wealthy. He had remained loyal to Germanicus, the nephew of Tiberius, whose sudden death had unsettled many. Sabinus was careful. He spoke rarely. He donated modestly. He never criticized, but he was close to Germanicus. And that was enough. Sejanus arranged for 4 men to befriend Sabinus. Over months, they coaxed words from him, slow, subtle admissions of sorrow, or regret, or fear. When he said that Tiberius was cold... they listened. When he wished Germanicus had lived, they wrote it down. When he sighed at the cruelty of the new Rome... they brought charges. He was arrested, tried, executed. His fortune, his name, his gardens, gone. Not even a plaque remained. This was how power operated now. And wealth, always a symbol of independence, was redefined. To be rich was to be capable of something. Perhaps generosity. Perhaps influence. Perhaps rebellion. And anything possible... was dangerous. Sejanus himself, of course, was not immune to the laws he had helped write. In time, Tiberius began to fear him. Perhaps he sensed the accumulation of power. Perhaps he saw too many estates changing hands. Perhaps he simply recognized a reflection. And so, from the cliffs of Capri, Tiberius acted. A letter was read aloud in the Senate, carefully worded, cold in tone. It began as praise, then turned. Sejanus was arrested on the spot. He had no warning, no protest, no support. His statues were torn down. His name was chiseled from stone. His children executed. His allies vanished. His wealth, immeasurable, was scattered. And those who had once toasted him quietly rearranged their loyalty. The memory of Sejanus lingered, not in name, but in fear. His fall taught the elites of Rome something lasting. It did not matter how rich you were. It mattered who watched you. And it mattered how closely. The informants remained. The trials continued. And the lesson spread. The surest way to lose everything was not to oppose the emperor, but to become too useful. Because usefulness led to attention, and attention led to envy, and envy led to silence. Even decades later, senators recalled the years of Sejanus with a hush. They remembered the dinners that ended in disappearance, the sealed scrolls that turned to accusations, the generosity punished, the riches taken, the names that once adorned fountains now spoken only in whispers, if at all. In this world, distance became safety. To live simply, to avoid grand gestures, to speak less. These were the new tools of survival. A villa might still gleam in the countryside. A garden might still flourish behind high walls. But inside, the laughter was muted, the music subdued, the guest list short. Because wealth, when seen too clearly, had a shape, and that shape was threat. The palaces of Domitian stood in stern contrast to those who once ruled. Where Augustus preferred modesty and soft tones, Domitian favored grandeur, bold symmetry, polished marble, vast halls echoing with his own image. He believed himself divine. Not poetically, literally. He insisted upon being called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and in such a world there was little room for competitors. He did not fear armies. He did not fear rebellion in the provinces. What he feared were conversations, private ones, behind heavy doors, over too much wine, and so he watched. He did not patrol the borders of the empire. He patrolled the houses of senators, the inheritance records, the guest lists, the art on the walls, the friends who visited too often. In this Rome, silence became a profession. Domitian believed deeply in order, in hierarchy, in control. And wealth, in its very nature, is unruly. It enables discretion, choice, escape, and so wealth had to be disciplined. His policy began with visibility. Senators were summoned regularly to court, not for discussion, but for presence. They stood in long rows before the emperor, awaiting notice. They dared not look directly at him. They answered questions simply. They volunteered no more than asked. In their eyes, behind the quiet, lived fear. Because even the mildest indulgence, a new garden statue, an imported mosaic, a particularly fine cloak, might be seen as arrogance, or worse, mockery. Those who prospered did so visibly for the emperor, naming new buildings in his honor, erecting statues of his family, dedicating libraries in his name. But those who prospered privately were at risk. Take, for instance, the fictional case of Senator Publius Junius Varro. He had no enemies. He wrote poetry in Greek. He funded the restoration of an old temple to Concordia. His estates were vast, but unassuming. Yet one summer, during a minor investigation into tax irregularities in Etruria, his name appeared on a list. An accountant noticed a land transfer that hadn't been recorded properly. A minor issue, likely clerical. But it was enough. The emperor was informed. The matter, unworthy of trial, was settled quietly. Varro died by suicide, or so the scroll said. His lands became imperial properties. His personal library, famed throughout Latium, was absorbed into the palace collection. His name never again spoken in the Senate. Such stories were not rare. And over time, the remaining senators learned. Not to avoid wealth. That was impossible. But to make it disappear, they moved property to cousins, hid ownership behind freedmen, built country estates with plain stone, unpainted. They dressed with restraint. They kept banquets short, the menus humble. They stopped writing poetry. They stopped inviting poets at all. Fear was the new etiquette, and Domitian fed that fear with care. He issued edicts about morality, luxury, and civic responsibility, and then punished those who violated them, real or imagined. He revived the delatorus, professional informants who could accuse a man, provide testimony, and profit from his downfall. It became a profession, a profitable one. Some senators, sensing the wind, chose to disappear. They moved to the provinces under pretense of retirement. They turned their homes into monasteries of sorts, where the laughter was muted and the walls were undecorated, where conversation never turned to politics, or emperors, or fortunes. The empire grew, but the ruling class shrank, not in number, but in voice. They still appeared in togas, still attended ceremonies, still recited oaths, but within them lived a hollowing, because what they once held, gravitas, auctoritas, dignitas, these things could no longer coexist with wealth, not unless that wealth was given to the emperor. Even estates, long considered the backbone of noble identity, became dangerous. If your fields were too productive, if your harvests exceeded expectation, if your villa became known for beauty or refinement, eyes turned toward you. And those eyes were often hungry, because the emperor, for all his power, had an empire to maintain, a court to fund, a military to appease. The treasury was always in need. What better source than dead men? Thus the estates of those condemned were not only forfeited, they were often catalogued in advance, as if expected. A senator might wonder, was his death written already in quiet ledgers? Was his life simply the delay between an audit and a signature? The Senate, once the ruling body of Rome, became something else, a theater, a shadow, a reminder, not of power, but of the idea of power, of what once was. Domitian himself would eventually fall, assassinated, as many emperors were, by those who stood nearest to him. But the fear he created remained. It echoed through the halls long after his body was gone. It settled into the marble, into the ink, into the habits of those who survived him. To be rich under Domitian was not a blessing. It was a condition to be explained, a burden to be justified, a wound to be hidden. And so the villas of Rome became quieter still. Wine was watered further. Fountains ran more gently. The music stopped, and the rooms grew colder, because wealth, once a symbol of triumph, had become something else, a question. And in the Rome of emperors, questions were dangerous things. The halls of the Senate had grown quiet, not with absence. The senators still came, still stood, still cast their votes. But something deeper had vanished. The voice of the elite, once proud, contentious, competing for influence, had become a murmur, or more often a silence. The wealthiest families of the Republic, names like Cornelius, Emilius, Julius, Claudianus, still existed. But their power no longer lived in legislation, or public works, or military glory. It lived, if it lived at all, in memory. And even memory was fragile now. Many of these families chose, in the final decades of the first century and into the second, to retreat. Not in disgrace, but in discretion. The villas remained, still shaded by cypress, still framed by low walls of pale stone. The atriums still echoed softly when walked across barefoot. But they were no longer centers of power. They became places of refuge or forgetting. Wealth in these homes was no longer for display. It was hidden in land holdings, in distant estates, in trust managed quietly by freedmen. The master of the house might own vast territories in Illyricum or vineyards in Gaul, but few knew this. He did not boast. He did not lend. He did not host feasts. He read. He wrote letters that would not be answered. He studied philosophy. There was, in this late age of the empire, a rise in stoicism among the elite. It offered a kind of consolation, a philosophical structure that asked not for public life, but for internal stillness, to be unmoved by fortune, to let go of honors, to accept what comes without complaint. Seneca, advisor to Nero, philosopher, immensely wealthy, had once tried to walk this line. He praised simplicity, but lived in a palace. He wrote of detachment, but was deeply entangled in court life. In the end, he was ordered to die. He complied calmly. His estate was absorbed. Others watched and learned. The safest wealth was that which did not attract. A man might give up his townhome and retire to a farm, not one with fountains and mosaics, but one with sheep and olives. He might dress in wool, eat plainly, live as if poor, and in so doing, escape the fate of the rich. Others turned to literature or to memory. They began to record their family's history in private scrolls, never shared, never read aloud. A subtle act of defiance, a way of saying, we existed, but even memory could be punished. Damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory, became an accepted tool of imperial wrath. A senator displeases the emperor? His statues are pulled down, his name struck from records, his estate divided. Even the epitaphs on family tombs are scraped away. His grandchildren grow up with silence where a legacy should be. In time, Rome became filled with absences, statues with heads removed, pedestals bearing only chipped Latin, houses once splendid, now shuttered, stories half told. The wealth of Rome did not vanish in a day. It did not burn or dissolve. It slipped quietly. It fell behind curtains. It was exchanged for distance or peace or invisibility, because invisibility was safer than pride. Some noble families, once kings of the Republic, deliberately left no heirs, not out of tragedy, but out of choice. They had watched too many sons sacrificed to proximity, too many daughters forced into marriages with unstable power. Let the line end, they thought. Let the name fall silent, so the walls might remain standing, and some ... simply let go. Imagine a man like Marcus Aurelius Petroninus, a senator's son, inheritor of a sprawling estate near Capua. He gives away the estate to a provincial official. He renames himself, moves to a fishing village on the Tyrrhenian coast, lives in a small stone house with an oil lamp and 2 dogs. He writes in the mornings, sleeps in the afternoons. No one visits. He is never remembered, but he never disappears either. He becomes what the wealthy feared to become, no longer important. And yet, in that anonymity, he finds a rare freedom. The empire marched on. New emperors rose, some brutal, some brilliant. But the rules remained. Wealth must serve the throne, or it must hide. And for those who had known another Rome, a Rome of competition, ambition, eloquence, and danger, the choice became clear. To exist, one must withdraw. To keep, one must release. To live, one must not be seen. So the domus, the Roman home, became a shell, the laughter less frequent, the garden fountains less ornate, the voices softer. And through it all, the rhythm continued, the footsteps of slaves sweeping marble, the slow scratch of a stylus on wax, the chirp of birds over faded mosaics, the whisper of a senator's name, ... forgotten. Imagine yourself now, not in a shadowed villa, but stepping out into the brilliance of Roman midday. The sun is high. The marble beneath your feet reflects white heat and shimmering light. Everywhere you turn, the city declares itself. Stone arches adorned with victories, porticos lined with columns of veined green Cipollino marble from distant quarries in Thessaly. Statues of heroes and emperors share space with fountains, gods, and muses, all carved with patience and precision. Rome is not a modest place, and for the wealthy, it cannot be. Here, wealth is expected. It is part of your role in society. You are not merely rich. You are a patron, a representative of tradition, a reflection of Roman greatness. And Roman greatness, it is believed, must be seen. It begins at home. Step through the doors of a senator's domus in the heart of the city, perhaps on the Esquiline Hill, overlooking the more crowded neighborhoods below. The entrance hall or vestibulum is not cluttered, it is curated. The floor is a mosaic, perhaps Neptune driving a team of hippocamps across a sea of black tiles. The walls are painted in deep red and soft ochre, frescoed with scenes from myth. Aeneas escaping Troy, Orpheus descending into Hades. A guest, upon entering, is meant to feel the message. This family is ancient, educated, prosperous, not just in coin, but in culture. Beyond the atrium, past the gentle splash of the household fountain, the triclinium, the dining room, awaits. It is here that wealth performs most clearly. Banquets in elite Roman homes were not merely meals. They were orchestrated experiences. The table was curved, the couches arranged in a semicircle around it. Guests reclined in order of status. Dishes were served in calculated sequence. Oysters from Brundisium, dormice stuffed with nuts and honey, exotic fruits chilled in snow brought from distant mountains. Servants moved silently. Music played in the background, flutes, lyres, sometimes even poetry recited by enslaved boys with high, clear voices. There was laughter, yes, but also assessment. Every item, from the imported garum to the sculpted silver drinking vessels, communicated something, but not too much, because that was the danger. Rome expected its elite to be generous, impressive, even grand, but never indulgent. There was a fine line between dignity and decadence, between cultural refinement and luxury for its own sake. And walking that line became an art. Wearing a purple-edged toga? Acceptable. Wearing an all-purple cloak, dyed with rare Tyrian pigment? Dangerous. That color belonged to emperors. Serving fresh fish? A sign of sophistication. But serving flamingo tongues or peacock brains? A sign of arrogance, and possibly mockery. The playwright Petronius, in his Satyricon, parodied this type of dinner with the infamous banquet of Trimalchio, a freedman whose wealth is obvious, but whose lack of taste makes him the object of ridicule. In reality, many of Rome's richest men were terrified of becoming Trimalchio, so they practiced conspicuous restraint. They served rare dishes, but emphasized their humble roots. They hosted large feasts, but praised simple flavors. They built massive estates, but kept parts of them intentionally unadorned, claiming rustic authenticity. It was a game, a performance of balance. Because to appear too frugal was to insult your peers, but to appear too lavish was to threaten the emperor or your neighbors. Even architecture became a minefield. Your villa might include a private bath, a gymnasium, an outdoor theater, but you ensured it did not rise higher than imperial structures nearby. You might commission statues, but of philosophers, not conquerors. Of ancestors, not heroes. Of gods, but only those popular with the current regime. Some men built secret rooms, hidden behind frescoed doors, where the truly luxurious art, erotic mosaics, golden ceiling tiles, imported ebony chairs, could be enjoyed only in trusted company. Beauty, too, could threaten. A garden designed by a famous landscape artist might draw praise or envy. A home painted by the same hand that decorated the palace could invite rumors. A library with scrolls rarer than those in the imperial collection, ... unwise. Even clothing played its part. Roman elite fashion was restrained in color, loose in form. A simple linen tunic under a white toga. Jewelry minimal. Hair styled with studied negligence. Women of elite status followed similar codes. Expensive fabrics. Yes, but no flashing gemstones. Perfumes from Arabia. Yes, but never overpowering. To break these norms was to invite commentary. And commentary, in Rome, could become accusation with alarming speed. Imagine the case of Titus Vibius Longinus, a senator famed for his gardens, which featured a man-made grotto, a singing fountain, and marble benches that stayed cool even in the midday sun. He hosted literary salons. He collected busts of philosophers, and rare manuscripts. His guests adored him. So did the gossip. A freedman, overheard in the marketplace, joked that Longinus's estate rivaled that of the emperor's retreat at Tibur. That joke, spoken once, repeated thrice, made its way to the palace. Within a month, Longinus received an invitation. A dinner with the emperor. A seat far from the central table. A cold smile. A reminder. He sold the grotto. The scrolls disappeared. He retired quietly, citing ill health. And so it went. Romans who displayed wealth learned to do so in code. They became masters of veiled status. Instead of saying, "Look at my fortune," they said, "Look at my modesty. Look at my piety. Look at what I do for Rome." The goal was to appear irreplaceable, but never threatening. Even public works followed this script. A man might fund a new aqueduct, but name it not after himself, but after a deceased ancestor. He might repair a road, but inscribe the stone only with his title, not his family name. This subtlety became the currency of survival. And behind every act of generosity, there was a quiet question. Was this enough, or too much? Because Rome had no law against luxury, but it had no tolerance for it either. In Rome, the most dangerous word a wealthy man could say was no. To say it was rare, to mean it rarer still. Because wealth, in the Roman world, was never yours alone. It belonged to your name, your family, your city, your emperor, your people. And those people always wanted something. Let us return now to our fictional friend, Lucius Septimius, the quiet patrician we met long ago. His estate thrives. His vineyards bring in fine wines. His tenant farmers are steady. And his name, carved modestly into the side of a restored aqueduct, is spoken with respect. But Lucius receives letters, dozens each month. A magistrate in the countryside writes to request funds for repairing a bridge. He says the town remembers Lucius's generosity from years past and hopes he will continue the tradition. A young man, formerly a client of Lucius's father, seeks a loan to fund his first legal case. He appeals not just to Lucius's wealth, but to his honor. A temple priest writes with great ceremony, explaining that the marble facade of the shrine to Minerva is in need of renewal. He suggests that Lucius's name would look splendid etched beside the doorway. A local council member writes, more bluntly, and asks whether Lucius might host the Saturnalia feast again this year. The people still remember the roasted boar and the garlanded slaves and the painted lanterns. It would not be the same without him. None of these letters demand, but none of them can be refused, because Roman generosity was not a choice. It was a performance, a public rhythm, and when you broke rhythm, people noticed. To give was noble. To give again, expected. To not give, insulting. And so Lucius obliges. He sends funds, approves the loan, commissions a new statue, pays for dancers and musicians and fresh garlands, and in doing so, he keeps the peace. But each act has a cost, not just in coin, though the coin drains steadily, quietly, like water from a cracked cistern. The cost is in invisibility. Each time he gives, he becomes more visible, more spoken of, more admired. And admiration in Rome is always the first step toward envy. And envy, the first whisper of accusation. But Lucius cannot stop, because to stop is to betray expectation. To betray expectation is to erode honor. And when honor erodes, status follows. The ancient Romans had no word for celebrity, but they understood its function. A man of rank, a vir nobis, was known. He was expected to support festivals, fund repairs, offer employment, train advocates, donate to temples, lend out his villa, provide horses for the militia, and in times of war, supply troops and arms. Sometimes he was expected to give even in mourning. There is a letter from Pliny the Younger, an historical voice, real and reflective, describing how his peers donated large sums to public games just after the death of a relative. The act was not questioned. It was admired. Even grief, it seemed, could be accompanied by spectacle. Others gave more than money. Some gave land, large tracts, offered as new colonies or public parks. Others funded banquets not once a year, but monthly. One man, historical again, famously paid to clothe all the poor children of a city for an entire winter. The effect? Applause, for a time. But such gifts were not final. They created ... expectation. Once a man gave, others began to assume. They adjusted their lives accordingly. They spent with the assumption that the patron would pay again. They planned festivals with his gold already counted. They raised buildings with space left for his name. And to disappoint that expectation, it was not just social awkwardness. It was seen as a breach of virtue, a crack in Fides' trust, a failure of Roman manhood. It could be whispered in courts, repeated in baths, satirized in plays. Even the emperor could take notice. If a senator known for generosity began to shrink his gifts, reduce his festivals, delay his support, it might be interpreted not as prudence, but as withdrawal, arrogance, or worse ... treason. Because in a world where emperors measured loyalty not just by words, but by gestures, a reduction in giving could be interpreted as rebellion in miniature. There was even a word for it: inertia, slowness of civic spirit. And so the cycle deepened. The rich gave and became visible. The visible were asked to give more, and those who gave most were watched most closely. Some tried to escape this cycle. A few sold portions of their estates, claiming famine or poor harvests. Some deliberately underreported their wealth. Others passed donations through proxies, clients or freedmen, so their own names stayed unspoken. But the crowd remembered, and emperors had records. And the more wealth you had, or were believed to have, the more you were expected to do. Even death did not end the requests. Wealthy men, in their wills, often left legacies to the public: donations to soldiers, gifts to the poor, money for games, maintenance for roads. And if they did not, their memory was questioned. Their tombs were left unadorned. Their families, if they had any, were sometimes punished, taxed, or quietly excluded from office. In this way, wealth became a kind of trap. It brought prestige, yes, but only so long as it flowed outward. To dam it, to protect it, to reserve it for private pleasure, was to insult Rome itself. And so the richest men gave and gave and gave again, until their coin ran low, until their land was divided, until their names faded, until they vanished, not in poverty, but in exhaustion. Rome never asked for everything at once. It asked slowly, consistently, forever. Rome was a city built not just in stone, but in style. Its greatness was not limited to conquests or law, but extended into the fine balance between culture and power, a world where sculpture, fashion, architecture, and poetry were not just ornaments of society, but instruments of status. To be wealthy in Rome was to be surrounded by beauty. But that beauty had to be calibrated, carefully, precisely, because when it shone too brightly, it could burn the one who owned it. Let us begin with architecture. A senator with taste and funds might wish to build a villa, not a sprawling palace, but a refined retreat. He might hire a team of Greek architects to design inner courtyards that caught the light perfectly at sunset, or columns that created subtle breezeways to cool the atrium. The materials mattered. Travertine? Common, durable. Marble from Luna? Acceptable, if used sparingly. Numidian yellow marble? Rare, expensive, and therefore dangerous. A villa built too well might draw visitors, poets, politicians, even the emperor himself. And what would they see? Imported onyx. A ceiling painted with mythological scenes in gold leaf. Bronze doors with inscriptions in Greek. A view from the peristyle garden that rivals that of the Palatine. Praise would be spoken aloud, but elsewhere, questions would be asked. How did he afford this? Why does he need such grandeur? Is this not a challenge, subtle, but present to imperial splendor? Suddenly, admiration gives way to murmurs. The architect is summoned to the palace. The stone supplier is asked to explain his accounts. A cousin is questioned in the forum, and the senator learns beauty, even when earned, is never neutral. He begins to let the garden grow wild. He delays repainting the atrium frescoes. The bronze doors are replaced with oak, not because he must, but because he has learned to unsee himself in public life. Even clothing carried this weight. A fine toga, well-folded, white, with a narrow stripe of purple, was the uniform of the senatorial class. But the cut, the thread count, the drape of the fabric, these were noticed. Jewelry was even riskier. A simple ring of iron marked a citizen. A ring of gold marked status. But a ring set with gems, particularly foreign ones, might mark arrogance. Roman society frowned upon excessive ornament, at least publicly. A man who wore layered necklaces, bright dyes, embroidered sandals, even if such items were legal, was at risk of satire. Satirists like Juvenal and Martial made sport of the perfumed elite. Wealthy men dressed too finely, moving too gracefully, speaking too delicately. But their jokes were not just jokes. They were warnings. Because mockery, in Rome, was not only a social tool, it was a political one. A few verses, performed at a feast, repeated in the baths, quoted by a rival, and a man might find his dignity slowly shredded. And if he had wealth, it would be assumed that he had earned it improperly. Even art could betray a man. Roman households, especially those of the elite, often displayed busts of ancestors, philosophers, or mythological figures. These were not idle decorations. They were statements of identity. But who you displayed, and how, mattered. A bust of Cicero suggested legal wisdom. A bust of Plato, philosophical humility. But a bust of Alexander the Great? Dangerous. That was aspirational. A wall fresco of Venus bathing? Elegant, if modest. A full mural of the Judgment of Paris? Risky, too suggestive of beauty's consequences. A mosaic of Mars in full battle pose? Disturbing, too bold, too warlike, too much. Even private art was political. Servants talked, artists talked. Guests, once welcomed, might one day become accusers. The sculpture you commission today could be the evidence used against you tomorrow. Many wealthy Romans learned this too late. Consider the historical figure of Titus Statilius Taurus, a man of vast estates and quiet dignity. He built Rome's first permanent amphitheater and funded public games at his own expense. The people loved him. But so, it seemed, did envy. Taurus's home was rumored to be more opulent than the imperial palace. He had a private bathhouse with mosaic floors, water piped from a distant spring, and ceiling carvings that mirrored the heavens. A few jokes circulated, and soon after, under Claudius, he was charged, not with treason, not with theft, but with practicing magic. A convenient accusation. His fortune was seized. His home passed to the state. His name, like so many, drifted into silence. Thus, a new form of Roman wisdom emerged. Understate. Do not deny your wealth. That was false modesty, and no one believed it. But do not shine. Do not provoke awe. Do not invite the question, why him? So elite Romans began to favor a cultivated plainness. Homes were beautiful, but not showy. Clothing elegant, but not adorned. Art symbolic, but never suggestive. Generosity clear, but not extravagant. Even the banquets changed. Where once guests were greeted by dancers and jugglers, now they were welcomed by readings from Virgil, or quiet debates on Stoic ethics. The wine flowed, but not freely. The music was tasteful, and always Roman, not too Greek, not too foreign. This was not humility. It was self-defense, because even beauty could become evidence of ambition, and ambition, in the wrong light, looked like rebellion. In the empire, possession was a fluid thing. On paper, you might own your villa, your art, your books, your garden of myrtle and laurel. But in practice, if someone more powerful admired them enough, they could be taken, not with force, not even with accusation, just with intention. Because in the imperial age, the emperor did not need to ask. He only needed to observe. Let us return now to the house of a man like Marcus Terentius Clemens, senator, scholar, poet, and connoisseur of beauty. His villa outside Rome is known not for extravagance, but for refinement. A terrace overlooking the sea, paved in dark glass tiles. A sculpture of Apollo in repose, brought from Rhodes. Not a grand statement, but a whispered marvel. A small octagonal library lined in cedarwood, where scrolls are arranged not by topic, but by mood. A garden of herbs shaped in the form of a labyrinth, its path marked by polished stones. Visitors speak of this place with a kind of hushed awe. One day, a high-ranking official visits, sent by the emperor himself. He praises the home. He walks the garden. He lingers in the library. Clemens smiles humbly. He speaks of his gratitude for the empire's peace, the emperor's wisdom. He offers wine, figs, poetry. The guest departs with warm words. The emperor, he says, would delight in such simplicity. And then, within the week, comes a letter. It is gentle, short, gracious. The emperor would like to visit the villa. It is not a command, but neither is it a request. And Clemens understands. When the emperor visits, he does not borrow. He does not inspect. He inherits. Within days, the estate is renamed Villa Caesarea, a property of the imperial household. The statue of Apollo is relocated to the Palatine. The scrolls are sealed and catalogued. Clemens is thanked publicly. He is even granted a pension, more than generous. But he does not return to the villa. His family moves inland. He lives out his years in a smaller house. He no longer collects. This was not a unique story. Many Roman estates, the finest ones, slowly became imperial retreats, those with the best aqueduct connections, the most carefully pruned gardens, the most tasteful mosaics. A rumor would begin. The emperor has taken notice. And before long, the gates would bear a new seal. Sometimes even ideas were taken. A new architectural style, atriums with reflecting pools and natural light, once pioneered by a provincial noble, soon became the standard in imperial residences. No credit given, no thanks needed. The empire, in its hunger for beauty, absorbed everything that stood out. A fine piece of silverwork, gone from the dinner table of its owner, now in the imperial treasury. A painting of Venus so detailed it was said to breathe, relocated, unannounced, from the home of a merchant to the emperor's gallery. A poet whose verses pleased a prince, invited to recite at court, then told he must write only for the imperial household. This was not theft in the legal sense. It was something subtler. Appropriation by admiration. The more something was praised, the more it risked being taken. In this way, the wealthy learned again to diminish, to hold back their finest art, to install beautiful mosaics only in private chambers, to keep gardens simple in the front, elaborate in the rear, to say, when asked, "No, it is nothing special." Even fashion followed this rule. A noblewoman might wear a gown of foreign silk, but only in private. In public, she chose linen. She avoided colors the empress favored. She removed her earrings before attending imperial festivals. She had seen what happened to women praised too often. Suddenly, they were summoned, then married off, or accused of arrogance. or their tailor was hired by the palace and no longer worked for them. Even words became dangerous. A certain phrasing in a speech, if too clever, might be repeated, then adopted, then claimed. You smiled, of course. You said, "It is an honor." And you let it go, because that was the only choice. Wealth in Rome had ceased to be private. It was not guarded behind locks or walls. It was displayed, admired, and finally, assumed. The emperor, after all, represented Rome itself, and anything too beautiful, too refined, too desirable, belonged to Rome, or should. A man might fight it, claim ownership, protest, refuse to hand over a prized painting. But then a second letter would come, then a visitor, then an accusation, then silence. So most men did not resist. They smiled, they bowed, they gave what was admired, and they survived. This, in the end, was the cost of wealth, not the coin spent, not the land worked, not even the envy of peers, but the moment when your taste, your eye, your refinement was too fine to ignore, and Rome reached out and quietly took it. The Roman house was not just a home. It was a vault, not only of silver and scrolls and wine, but of memory, of debt, of expectation. And when a wealthy man died, his house changed. The doors were closed, draped in black. The slaves dressed in dark wool. The women wailed publicly. The atrium was cleared for the imagines, the ancestral masks, to be brought out and displayed. But beneath this mourning lay something quieter, more complex, because death in Rome did not mean release from wealth. It meant that someone else now carried it, and with it carried risk. The Roman system of testamentum, the will, was a sacred and political act. It was written with formality, often witnessed by 7 men, and sealed tightly until death. But even before it was opened, everyone watched. Would the son inherit? Would the daughter's dowry increase? Would the slaves be freed? Would the emperor receive a gift? That last question, more than any, carried consequence. Because in the imperial era, wealthy men were expected, unofficially but firmly, to leave something in their will to the emperor or his family. It was a gesture of loyalty, of gratitude, of self-protection beyond the grave. And failing to do so, that was interpreted as an insult. The emperor might then question the entire will. A legal inquiry might be launched, the man's loyalty revisited, his previous generosity reinterpreted, his estate suspended, frozen in legal limbo. Sometimes heirs were required to defend the dead, to stand in court and explain why their father had not honored the emperor, to claim oversight or error, or, most carefully of all, to rewrite the will, voluntarily, and offer the donation retroactively. Others gave even more preemptively. Some left their villas outright to the emperor. Some granted him guardianship over their sons. Some created foundations in the emperor's name, funding temples, roads, or festivals long after they were gone. And yet, none of this was guaranteed, because the emperor had legal tools. He could claim that the deceased had benefited from imperial generosity and had not repaid it. He could argue that tax obligations had been hidden. He could simply claim that the wealth would be better administered by the state. Confiscation did not always require proof, only presence. Even family members could find themselves disinherited not by law, but by influence. And so, many families made compromises. They divided their estates carefully. One part to the emperor, one to the son, one to freedmen, one to the city. But the consequences endured. The heir, even if successful, inherited not just property, but obligation. He must now manage the estate, pay the debts, keep the clients, uphold the rituals, fund the festivals, maintain the tombs. He was not free. He was bound. Bound to the legacy of his father, bound to the expectations of the people. bound to the quiet gaze of the palace. Even in death, a wealthy Roman man continued to be visible. His will was read aloud, his name echoed in forums, his gifts judged, weighed, recorded. And if a son failed to meet those expectations, he too could fall. There were many examples, quiet ones. The son of a nobleman, inheriting vast lands in Sicilia, refused to sponsor the expected games. He claimed frugality, then illness. Rumors began. Within a year, the lands were seized under a pretense of legal restructuring. He was never tried. He simply vanished. A daughter, granted a sizable dowry, declined an arranged marriage to a man favored by the palace. Her funds were redirected through a cousin. She married a provincial magistrate. She never returned to Rome. Even freedmen were entangled. Many wealthy Romans promised freedom to slaves in their wills, conditional upon service or loyalty or some future act. But if the emperor disliked the arrangement, the freedom could be overturned, the freedmen reclassified, the promise erased. One freedman, named Gaius Felix, was promised land and livestock, but his master failed to name the emperor in his will. The emperor, disappointed, claimed the estate. Gaius Felix returned to servitude. He lived another 12 years, never speaking of the promise again. In time, these stories produced a culture of caution. Fathers spoke carefully in their final months. Heirs were advised to prepare tribute in advance. Wills were revised multiple times, sometimes secretly. Slaves whispered about hidden copies. A man could not die quietly. He had to plan his disappearance. Even memory was curated. Many families, fearing imperial suspicion, burned family records, removed statues, erased inscriptions, renamed children, moved tombs. It was not uncommon for a man's name to be written in sand, not stone. And when visitors asked, "Whose house was this?" the answer came, "No one. It is just a house." And yet, the floor mosaics still bore initials. The garden paths still followed noble shapes. The olive trees, planted in deliberate rows, still told a story of wealth, a story of legacy, a story no one wanted to tell. So inheritance, in Rome, was never simply the transfer of things. It was the transfer of burden. And the wiser heirs learned early. Keep the name quiet. Keep the gifts modest. Keep the walls low. And keep your distance from memory. Because even the past, especially the past, could be confiscated. Time passed. The Rome of golden forums and imperial eyes began to dim. Emperors still ruled, yes, but their names came faster, their reigns shorter. Senators still spoke, but fewer listened. Armies still marched, but more often toward Rome than away from it. And in the hills beyond the city, in the quiet countryside of Latium, Campania, Africa, Gaul, the great Roman estates began to change. They did not burn. They did not collapse in storms. They simply slowed. Imagine one such estate. Once the pride of the Aurelian family, its name carved in Latin into the keystone above the gate. Rows of olive trees trimmed for centuries. A long colonnade where ancestors once paced, dictating letters to scribes. An atrium that once echoed with laughter and soft conversation. Now the gate hangs crooked. The trees grow wild. The stones of the courtyard are mossy, uneven. The fountain has stopped, though rain still fills the basin. The family? Scattered. The current heir lives in Constantinople, a minor bureaucrat. He has not visited in years. The staff? Reduced to a few loyal workers, descendants of slaves, now peasants, now landbound in practice, if not in law. There is no feast, no banquet, no theater. The mosaic in the triclinium, once polished to mirror finish, is now dulled. A few tesserae have come loose. No one knows where the original artist was from. In a locked cabinet near a crumbling scroll of Horace's Odes rests a ring once worn by a senator whose name no one pronounces correctly anymore. This scene, multiplied across the empire, became common. The long era of estate wealth was unraveling. Why? Not by revolt, not by law, but by weight, the cost of maintenance, the pressure of obligation, the drain of taxation. The empire, needing coin, turned more and more to landowners, taxing grain, cattle, and property. But the yield shrank. The trade routes faltered. The roads, once kept up by local elites, fell into disrepair. And so the great estates, once hubs of cultural and economic life, became burdens, inherited by sons who lacked the skills or patience, passed to daughters who married into other houses, managed by agents, then neglected by agents, sold off bit by bit. Some were given to the church in exchange for burial prayers or simply relief. Others were seized by local military leaders, quietly, unofficially. A new general might ride through the land, find the gates unguarded, and claim the house in the name of the emperor. No one objected. No one even noticed. Wealth, once measured in display, was now measured in distance. Could it be protected? Hidden? Could it survive a passing army? A new tax? A shifting border? If not, it was released. And so Rome entered a new era of vanishing wealth, not from the poor, but from the rich. A man might still own land, but the deed no longer mattered. The local bishop held more sway than any senator. A man might still wear fine robes, but no one asked about the tailoring. A woman might still serve honeyed dates from silver platters, but the guests were fewer, quieter, more afraid. In the countryside, the word dominus began to change meaning. It no longer meant senator. It meant landholder, local authority, an inherited position, more feudal, less Roman. And the old houses? They became ruins. Villas whose walls had once been warmed by music and the soft rustle of scrolls now stood open to the wind. Some were looted for stone, their columns pulled down. Others became monasteries, repurposed, softened, their grandeur made humble. Others simply decayed. The gardens overgrew, the statues cracked, the mosaics faded, and in the silence something strange happened. The names disappeared. Not all at once, but slowly. A family of great pride, the Lentuli, the Fabi, the Licini, might survive only in an inscription at the edge of a road, worn thin by time. A name etched into the base of a statue in a museum, with no body above it. A coin, unearthed centuries later, bearing the face of a man no one remembers. What had been wealth became archaeology, and what had been power became silence. It is not tragic. Not exactly. Just ... soft. A long sleep. A whisper. You see, wealth in Rome was never designed to last forever. It was performative, responsive, conditional. It lived only in its use, its admiration, its risk. And when the world changed, when people stopped watching, when emperors stopped caring, the wealth simply slipped away. No one came to seize it. No one came to praise it. No one came to ask for a donation or tribute. The marble remained. The wind passed through it. The empire shifted elsewhere. And the names, once so carefully guarded, fell into the dust between stones. It is strange, isn't it, how something so sought, so carefully guarded, so fought over for generations, can dissolve. Wealth, in the Rome we've wandered through together, was once a beacon. It brought fame, respect, clients, titles, lovers, friends. It filled the air with scent and song. It made the courtyards gleam. It brought laughter into the dining hall, and dancers into the garden under lantern light. It fed armies, built roads, commissioned epics. It carved your name into stone, with stony roads, And wealth in Rome was never still. It was not held. It moved. It was given or taken, admired or envied, displayed or hidden. In the Republic, it meant power. In the Empire, it meant danger. In decline, it meant obligation. And in memory, it meant ... nothing at all. So many of the names we spoke in earlier centuries, the Scipios, the Claudians, the Fabians, the Luculi, became whispers. Just entries in dusty books, faces on old coins. No great catastrophe claimed them. Just ... time. Imagine again a villa, once rich with linens from Egypt, plates of silver from Spain, mosaics from Antioch, scrolls from Athens. Now ... the roof has collapsed. A fig tree grows through the tile. A mosaic peeks through the dirt. A child from a nearby village sits on the steps, plucking olives. He does not know the name of the house, but he rests in its shade just the same. And that, perhaps, is what remains of Roman wealth. Not the gold, not the titles, not even the statues, but the shade, the soft places it left behind. Because Rome's rich did not vanish entirely. They simply fell out of memory. Their need to be remembered, their constant pursuit of honor, inscription, and legacy was their culture. But legacy, like coin, depends on circulation. And when the world stopped spending their names, when the language changed, the cities shifted, the values turned, those legacies simply ... settled. Not in disgrace, not in ruin, but in stillness. And perhaps you notice how similar it sounds to many stories. Not just Ramong, a fortune built, a family raised, a house named, a crest carved, and then children move away. The doors close, the garden grows, the name is spoken less often. This is not uniquely Roman, it is human. And yet, something in Rome made the pattern starker, clearer, because they recorded so much, carved so deeply, planned for forever. But even marble forgets. And gold, so soft, cannot resist the silence of centuries. Still, traces remain. A poem, a broken statue, a fountain still catching rain, a name on a map, worn and altered. And in that way, Roman wealth never fully vanishes. It just changes form, from power ... to memory, from memory to silence, from silence ... to curiosity. And now, as you rest, wherever you are, some small part of it stirs again, because you've listened, and through your attention, the names flicker, even if only for a moment, even if they return to quiet right after. You are still here, still breathing, still resting. Somewhere, perhaps beneath a blanket, or beside a quiet window, or tucked into the familiar stillness of your own room. You've drifted through Roman marble halls, past fading mosaics and forgotten tombs. You've walked alongside senators whose names are no longer spoken. You've watched candles flicker in atriums now covered in dust. And you've seen the strange, soft unraveling of fortune. And now ... we return, but not abruptly. Not with noise or light or lesson. Just a breath, a gentle pause. Let the ancient city fall away slowly. The weight of togas, the coolness of stone, the hush of courtly speech, the scrape of sandals on mosaic. Let it all slip back into shadow. Because for all its glory, all its pageants and rituals and guarded treasures, Rome was never built to outlast everything. It was built to impress, to endure, to shine. But even stars, in time, dim. And here you are, in a world far from Rome, a world with soft pillows and electric lamps, and windows that close tightly against the wind. A world where no emperor watches, no senator demands, no scribes await your decisions. A world where your name does not need to be carved in marble to matter. You do not need to be remembered by monuments. You do not need to prove your virtue through donations or sacrifice. You do not need to perform, or guard, or calculate. You are enough, now, as you are. Here, there are no scrolls to sign, no heirs to protect, no statues to polish. Only this moment, this silence, this peace. The Romans feared obscurity. They feared being forgotten. But you are allowed to forget, allowed to rest, allowed to let the old world fade into sleep. Because whatever wealth meant to them, all that striving, that careful balance, that beautiful danger, tonight it means only this: a story, a sound, a place your thoughts can wander until they fade into the dark. So let go now. Let the olive trees blur. Let the marble cool. Let the names drift back into history. And let your breathing slow. Here, in this quiet corner of the world, you are safe. You are untouched by inheritance or envy. There are no imperial letters, no watchful statues, no courts of honor. Just you, just rest, just the soft hush of centuries settling around you. Just sleep. If you're still with us, thank you for listening. If you're already asleep, that's just fine too. And if you're new here, you're warmly invited to subscribe to our quiet corner of YouTube. And if you'd like, leave us a soft little comment below. Let us know where and when you're rewatching from. Perhaps you're listening late at night or drifting off with the morning light. Wherever you are, may you rest deeply and dream gently. Good night.